ICE was our first customer 43 years ago and has been our largest customer for over a decade. From the end of 2024 through the end of 2025, ICE populations in our care increased 5,903 individuals to just over 16,000, or 58%.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voice is very much not like Patrick Swindle, who you heard up top. Swindle, which, yes, is his real name, is the president and chief operating officer of the Tennessee-based CoreCivic, one of the largest private prison operators in the country. He was speaking to investors on the company's most recent earnings call. We're going to spend most of this episode talking about CoreCivic and other profiteers who are raking in millions of dollars from the Trump administration's aggressive immigration enforcement campaign. This is the first of two parts looking at ICE detention in the South. Next week, we'll talk about rising resistance to the expansion of detention centers, including in Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn's own backyard. This week, we'll listen to and annotate some notable moments in that earnings call. You'll hear CoreCivics leaders talk proudly about their partnership with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and their rosy projections of an ever-growing population of detainees, or as they put it, demand for their services. It all reveals a lot about what's really going on with the mass deportation program and who's benefiting from it, and how it connects to the South's long history of for-profit incarceration. As always, you can find references and more information in the show notes. Later, in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll look at a legacy center and exhibition dedicated to an outsider artist in Mississippi. So now to CoreCivic. The company's based in Brentwood, Tennessee. It was founded in Nashville in 1983 as the Corrections Corporation of America. It's one of the two largest private prison companies in the United States. The other is the GEO Group, based in Boca Raton, Florida. It's not exactly a coincidence that for-profit prisons have taken root most readily in the South, with its long history of convict leasing and prison labor. In CoreCivic's case, the connection is direct. One of its co-founders, Terrell Don Hutto, got his start in the late 1960s working at Ramsey Prison Farm, run by the state of Texas on land southwest of Houston that had formerly been home to slave plantations. Here's how reporter Shane Bauer, author of the 2018 investigative book American Prison, characterized Hutto's experiences there. Quote, "Mostly black convicts were forced to pick cotton from dawn to dusk for no pay. It was 1967 and the Beatles' All You Need Is Love was a hit, but the men in the fields sang songs with lyrics like, 'Old master, don't you whip me, I'll give you $50.' Hutto's family lived on the plantation and even had a houseboy, an unpaid convict who served them." Unquote. Hutto went on to work in state prison systems in Arkansas and Virginia. He started Corrections Corporation of America with partners Tom Beasley and Richard Krantz. Beasley was a lawyer and former chair of the Tennessee Republican Party. Krantz was a Nashville businessman who had worked in real estate and television and had also been a roommate of Beasley's at West Point. CCA pioneered the private prison model, contracting with both federal and state governments to house and manage prison populations at a set daily rate per inmate. It grew quickly, and by 1998 it made Fortune's list of the 100 fastest-growing companies in the United States. Immigration detention has been part of its portfolio from the start. Its very first contract was with what was then called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, to operate a hastily remodeled hotel in Houston as a detention center. The company has also for decades attracted controversy, criticism, and lawsuits from prisoners and their families over allegations of abusive conditions. By the end of the second Obama administration in 2016, public opposition to private prisons had grown to the point that the Department of Justice said it would phase out the federal use of them. That same year, conscious of the toll of years of negative publicity, the Corrections Corporation of America rebranded itself as CoreCivic. Company officials said the name was intended to reflect a broader scope of services, but in reality, detention remains their primary business. President Trump reversed the Obama Department of Justice order during his first term, which was a boom time for private prisons. But when President Biden took office in 2021, he issued an executive order to end federal private prison contracts, with a major exception. Although he had promised immigrant rights advocates that he would also end for-profit immigration detention, he did not. In fact, when New Jersey passed a law in 2023 that would have shut down a CoreCivic immigration detention center in the state, the Biden administration supported CoreCivic in a successful lawsuit to keep it open. And of course, the second Trump administration has been a whole new dawn for immigration detention. Investors understood it. CoreCivic's stock price leapt 59% after Trump's election in 2024, and Geo Groups saw a nearly 100% rise. By the end of 2025, the federal government was keeping more than 70,000 immigrants in detention facilities, the most ever, up from about 45,000 at the end of the Biden administration. Which brings us to CoreCivic's February 12th earnings conference call, a standard quarterly event for publicly traded companies to report their financial performance and outlook for the future.
And thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Q4 2025 CoreCivic earnings conference call.
On the call were CoreCivic President and COO Patrick Swindle, who was promoted to that post in December 2024, and Chief Financial Officer David Garfinkel. They had good news to share. The company's total revenue for 2025 was $2.2 billion, up 13% from the year before. And its earnings before taxes, interest, depreciation, and amortization, a favored Wall Street metric known as EBITDA, which you'll hear a lot in this call, was up 11%. Even better from the company's point of view, the year ended on a strong note. Fourth quarter revenue was up 26% from the previous year, reflecting a surge in immigrant detentions as ICE hired thousands of new agents. At the end of 2025, CoreCivic was holding nearly a quarter of all immigration and customs enforcement detainees. Swindle began the call with a report, which he introduced in the dispassionate language of corporate finance. If you didn't know who he was talking about, it could be nearly any company traded on the stock exchange.
On this morning's call, we will discuss our latest operational results and update you on the latest developments and opportunities with our government partners. Following my opening remarks, I will hand the call over to our CFO, Dave Garfinkel, who will provide greater detail on our fourth quarter and full year 2025 financial results, as well as introduce our 2026 financial guidance. Dave will also provide an update on our capital structure, including activity on our share repurchase program and other balance sheet initiatives.
He then moved into discussion of CoreCivic's actual business. But you'll notice something here and throughout the call. What CoreCivic actually does, lock people up in cells and keep them there against their will, is never referred to except obliquely. The discussion is of facilities and occupancy and beds, but rarely of people. Swindle reports on what he calls the activation of 4 prisons that had been closed, some because of the Biden administration's move away from private prisons, at least for U.S. citizens, and others because they had lost state contracts. For example, the Diamondback Correctional Facility in Watonga, Oklahoma, had been sitting empty since 2010. It was built to hold inmates from Arizona until it ended its practice of sending prisoners out of state.
First, I'd like to provide an update on our activation activities, where we continue to move towards stabilized occupancy in mid-2026. As a reminder, we announced new awards in the second half of 2025 at the 600-bed West Tennessee Detention Facility, the 2,560-bed California City Immigration Processing Center, the 1,033-bed Midwest Regional Reception Center, and the 2,160-bed Diamondback Correctional Facility.
The California City Center that Swindle mentioned deserves some particular notice. It's in the middle of California's Mojave Desert, miles from any town. CoreCivic built it in 1998 and ran it as a federal prison until 2013. When that contract ended, the state of California leased the property and ran it as a state prison with its own staff until 2023. Still owned by CoreCivic, it then sat empty until last year, when the company reopened it under contract with ICE. Since then, it has generated numerous reports of abuse and neglect. In a New Yorker article in January 2026 with the headline, "The Cruel Conditions of ICE's Mojave Desert Detention Center," reporter Oren Peleg wrote that within months of its reopening, the center became notorious for neglecting the medical care of its detainees. After talking to many currently or formerly held there, he wrote, quote, "These detainees reported adequate care at other ICE detention and processing facilities they were previously held at, and described the California City facility as unique in its mistreatment of those held in its custody," unquote. Peleg said detainees told him about, quote, "extremely delayed appointments with healthcare professionals, the denial of medications and treatment, experiences with unsafe and unsanitary living conditions, and a general antagonism by medical staff toward detainees," unquote. According to the article, one detainee with a bleeding ulcer was refused a request to see a gastrointestinal specialist and told that he should go back to your own country if he wanted medical care. In November, the Prison Law Office, the ACLU, and other organizations filed a class action lawsuit against ICE and the Department of Homeland Security over conditions at the center. In the filing, detainees refer to California City as a, quote, torture chamber and, quote, hell on earth. Swindle didn't think any of that was worth mentioning to investors. He did talk a bit more about the fourth reactivated vacant prison, which is in Leavenworth, Kansas. CoreCivic was ready to receive prisoners there, but there had been a hang-up.
While 3 of the 4 previously idle facilities continue to receive additional populations, the 4th, Midwest Regional, continues to experience a delay in the intake process as we await the result of a special use permit application that we filed in December 2025. We've been engaged with the city on the application, and the conversations have been productive. In aggregate, and excluding Midwest Regional, these 3 new contract awards are expected to generate annual revenue of approximately $260 million once our operations normalize.
So, about that, what Swindle is calling Midwest Regional here was formerly known as the Leavenworth Detention Center in Leavenworth, Kansas. It holds sort of a special place in the CoreCivic universe. In 1992, it was the first private prison opened under a federal agency contract with the U.S. Marshals Service. The prison expanded over the decades from holding 460 people to a little over 1,100. It also accumulated a growing number of complaints about safety and living conditions. In 2021, the ACLU sent a letter to the Biden administration detailing reports of violence involving both prisoners and guards. It urged the administration not to renew CoreCivic's contract at the facility. And it didn't. When the contract expired at the end of that year, remaining prisoners were transferred and the prison was closed. Last year, CoreCivic contracted with ICE to return it to service as an immigrant detention center. But there was local pushback, and a lawsuit forced CoreCivic to apply to the city for a new special use permit. That's the discussion Swindle referred to, which is still unresolved. Swindle then moved on to broader discussion of what he called the business climate, which is to say, the climate of the business of locking up immigrants.
Moving to a discussion of the business climate, in early January 2026, nationwide ICE detention populations were at historical highs of around 69,900 individuals, an increase of almost 10,000 individuals from the end of the third quarter. ICE was our first customer 43 years ago and has been our largest customer for over a decade. From the end of 2024 through the end of 2025, ICE populations in our care increased 5,903 individuals to just over 16,000, or 58%.
Looking forward, Swindle said he sees ongoing opportunities. CoreCivic has still more vacant prisons just waiting to be reopened. There are also some open beds at already operating prisons. Swindle assured his shareholders that the company is ready if and when ICE calls.
As we continue to look for additional ways to meet our government partners' needs, we believe we can make available substantial capacity to meet future demand. Even after the aforementioned activations, we own 5 idle corrections and detention facilities containing approximately 7,000 beds. Along with surge capacity we've made available at certain facilities and partial capacity we have in facilities that are currently in operation, we've informed ICE that we could provide it with nearly 13,000 additional beds. And this does not include additional capacity we may be able to provide through other means.
I wanted to play this next short clip just because it's one of the few times where Swindle acknowledges the people his company imprisons as something more than part of a so-called market demand. The word humane stands out here, but then also listen to all of the other things that come after it.
We're confident that the detention beds that we provide are the most humane, most efficient logistically, most compliant, most secure, are readily available, and provide the best value to the government.
The best value to the government. The best value to taxpayers. It's a good reminder of who is actually paying for all of this, whose money CoreCivic is using to bolster its bottom line and pay its executive salaries and lobby for more public contracts. It's our money. It is even the money of the very people they are incarcerating. One study found that undocumented immigrants paid an estimated $97 billion in combined federal, state, and local taxes in 2022. Are they getting the best value from their tax dollars going to pay CoreCivic? Are we? In making a point about how quickly the company moved to take advantage of ICE opportunities in 2025, Swindle talked about yet another facility, the Dilley Immigration Processing Center in Dilley, Texas. It's a family detention center where parents can stay together with children. As Swindle noted in the call, and as a reminder that mass immigrant detention has been a bipartisan policy, it was originally commissioned and opened in 2014 under the Obama administration. Swindle described it with pride.
Our Dilley Immigration Processing Facility is a great example. This is a purpose-built facility for family residential housing that we first operated in 2014 under the Obama administration. Last year, we entered into a new agreement that extends into 2030. As part of that contract, we must meet performance requirements based on a combination of rigorous accreditation and government-established performance standards. There are full-time federal monitors on site to ensure accountability and compliance with the contract. This includes specific quality measures and standards for cleanliness, high-quality food and basic necessities, legal access, medical care, and translation services. For those of you interested in learning more about this facility, I would encourage you to visit our website at www.CoreCivic.com, where you can take a virtual guided tour.
I did go and take the virtual guided tour. It shows playgrounds, classrooms, a medical clinic, a room where children can play video games. The sleeping quarters are rows of bunk beds where it says families are kept together, right next to other complete strangers, of course. But there's a funny thing about the photos in the tour. There are no people in them. They show pristine, empty rooms. This is partly for legal privacy reasons, I suppose, but the absence feels deliberate. As if CoreCivic knows that the illusion it is trying to present of a professional, friendly place, like a children's hospital maybe, would be harder to sustain if you could see the people, and especially the children, being held prisoner there. Swindle mentioning the Dilley Center at all took me aback, because Dilley had been very prominent in the news in the days before the earnings call. It was where 5-year-old Liam Ramos, the boy in the blue bunny hat, was taken with his father when they were arrested by federal agents in Minneapolis. Photos of Liam being detained made international news and fueled public outrage. He and his father were released on February 1st after a federal judge ruled that agents hadn't followed correct procedures in detaining them. Then on February 9th, the nonprofit media site ProPublica published a report about other children at Dilley. It included drawings and letters recounting their fears and sadness at being held at the center. A 14-year-old girl from Colombia wrote, quote, "The workers treat the residents unhumanly, verbally, and I don't want to imagine how they would act if they were unsupervised," unquote. Another Colombian girl who is 9 years old drew a picture of her and her mother wearing their detainee ID badges. She wrote, quote, "I am not happy. Please get me out of here," unquote. Swindle, of course, did not mention any of that to his shareholders. What he did talk about was the money that came from all of it.
Federal partners, primarily Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the U.S. Marshals Service, comprised 57% of CoreCivic's total revenue in the fourth quarter. Revenue from our federal partners increased 49% during the fourth quarter of 2025 compared with the prior year quarter. Further breaking down our federal revenue from ICE increased to $124.4 million, or 103.4%, while revenue from the U.S. Marshals Service decreased by $11.3 million versus the prior year quarter.
Swindle wrapped up his presentation with a bit of corporate rah-rah that could have come from any company, again using words like core portfolio to refer to large prison complexes holding thousands of people.
I'm confident we have the right plan and the right teams in place to be successful both in these and future activations. In the meantime, we continue to remain focused on effectively managing our core portfolio and ensuring we meet our high operational standards as well as those of our government partners. Without this focus and strong performance, these additional opportunities would not exist.
He then passed off to CFO Dave Garfinkel, who provided the meat of what investors probably really wanted to hear about: revenues, profits, and growth projections. This particular clip caught my ear not for the blizzard of financial jargon, but for one word that he used to describe CoreCivics services.
The increase in adjusted EBITDA from the prior quarter of $18.3 million resulted from higher demand and utilization of our solutions by our federal and state partners, including revenue from ICE that more than doubled.
Solutions. If you ran a company that specialized in mass detention of people in prison facilities that meet the literal dictionary definition of concentration camps, maybe you'd be careful about referring to what you offer as solutions. The call moved next into questions from investors, which, like the rest of the discussion, felt weirdly disconnected from the actual business at hand. There were queries about capacity, liquidity, stock buybacks, but a couple of callers showed at least some awareness of headlines outside the business pages. One question came from Greg Gibbous, a senior research analyst at Northland Securities, an investment firm based in, of all places, Minneapolis. And Gibbous did have questions about the goings-on in his city, but mostly a concern that comments by Trump administration border czar Tom Homan might represent a reduction in ICE detentions, and therefore fewer bodies in CoreCivics care.
Great. Good morning, Patrick, Dave. Congrats on the results. Wondering if you could maybe speak to the current contracting environment and how your dialogue with ICE and the DHS has trended of late. And, also maybe wondering along those lines if you could or would be willing to opine on the recent headlines related to the Minnesota pullback that Homan announced and, possibly investors misinterpreting that as a national mandate change.
Swindle was swift to reassure him that Minneapolis was an unusual operation because of its size, and reducing its scope shouldn't mean fewer detainees nationwide, or what he refers to here as pipeline opportunity.
At this moment, there isn't a specific update I'd give you in terms of pipeline opportunity, but I can assure you that we remain in ongoing dialogue around how we can best support our partners' mission. Second part of that question is I think you really have to pan back to national enforcement activity and approach. At any given time, ICE is taking different enforcement approaches across the country. And so I think if you were to look at Minnesota specifically as a discrete example, that was a larger scale, discrete enforcement action that obviously is a bit different than what we've seen around the country. And so I think to extrapolate the activity or the action that was discussed this morning nationally, I think is difficult because I think that was a unique enforcement action. And so if I look across the country, I at this point don't see meaningful changes in enforcement style or approach, as that approach has not been consistent with what we saw in Minneapolis because it was a large-scale, discrete initiative.
Then there was the call from Joe Gomez of Noble Capital. The audio on Gomez's line is a little weak, but I wanted to play this exchange because of the upbeat tone and tenor of Gomez's questions, as he asked Swindle to estimate how much financial upside there could be if CoreCivic actually fills all of its currently vacant facilities and beds. He also expressed concern that ICE has been a little slower than expected in ramping up the volume of its detentions, and asked for reassurance that the pace will pick up. Swindle explained that ICE is a, quote, complex ecosystem, unquote. This runs a couple of minutes as there's back and forth between the two of them.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my question.
Good morning, Joe.
So let's go a little blue sky here. You talked about, potential upside for Midwest. But let's assume, ICE has got the 10,000 new enforcement employees up and running, increasing the pace of detainees out there. I think you talked about 12,000 or 13,000 beds between existing contracts and idle facilities. If we got to the point where ICE was to contract for those beds or fill all of those beds, what could that mean for upside in terms of revenue and EBITDA?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. I guess if you took 13,000 beds, an average per diem, I don't know, just say $125 a day. That's $593 million of incremental revenue, and if you assume we're on a 23% margin in the fourth quarter, that's $136 million of incremental EBITDA. Just to kind of use publicly available numbers in our reports.
Okay, so it's potential nice upside again, blue sky, but just be nice to see that. And then, one of the big questions I think or concerns for investors out there has been the pace of detention by ICE, that it's been below what the people out, investors had thought was going to be. I think people thought we'd be at that 100,000 level. We're at a little over 70,000 here. I mean, what is your kind of viewpoint here? What are you seeing in terms of the pace of detention? Have you seen it starting to crawl back up here? We're still waiting to kind of see more of a measured pace here in terms of detentions.
So I would answer that through a couple lenses. I guess one of them is if you go back to the end of the prior administration coming into the current administration, you were looking at roughly 45,000 funded beds that were operational. And so you're now have increased to just over 70,000 beds in a fairly short period of time. I think one of the things that at least been apparent to me throughout this process is the expectation that one can see a significant change in the infrastructure and ecosystem occur immediately. And when you're looking at the way that ICE approaches enforcement action, nothing occurs immediately. And I think as maybe you or someone else noted, the organization had not fully ramped its team until really the end of the year last year. So as we think about timing, it does take time because it is a very complex ecosystem, and as that ecosystem grows, it's going to result in additional bed demand. It has been slower than I think some thought might occur, but certainly when you take a step back at the 30,000 foot level and look at the magnitude of scale that's already increased, as well as the timing of when the additional enforcement infrastructure was put in place, one can reasonably expect you would see continued growth.
Listening to the call, with its blasé boosterism and revenue growth projections, it was hard for me not to think of Hannah Arendt's endlessly quoted observation about Adolf Eichmann representing what she called the banality of evil. The phrase is especially tempting because Eichmann played an instrumental role in organizing the mass deportation of Jews to concentration and extermination camps. But it also seems in some ways insufficient. At his war crimes trial in 1961, Eichmann's defense was that he was just following orders within a rigid bureaucracy. CoreCivic and its investors aren't following orders. They're enthusiastically seeking contracts. Nobody's making them do it. They're pursuing year-over-year quarterly gains. They're chasing EBITDA. They're speculating about blue skies and upsides to their business model. They're promising stable occupancy by mid-26. CoreCivic does not run death camps, it's true, although people do die in their custody. For example, it runs the Trousdale Turner Correctional Center in Hartsville, Tennessee, a state prison where 98 prisoners died between 2019 and 2022. The number was high enough that even Tennessee's Republican legislature passed a bill that will reduce Trousdale's population, and therefore its revenues, by 10% anytime the death rate is more than twice the average at the state's publicly owned prisons. But even if the deaths in CoreCivic's detention centers are more of a side effect than a mandate, there's no escaping the brutal calculus at the heart of its business. CoreCivic does best when the government is rounding up more people and needs someone to keep them locked up. Liam Ramos, the boy in the bunny hat, was kept prisoner by CoreCivic for 10 days. CoreCivic is paid about $165 a day for each detainee. U.S. District Judge Fred Beery, who ordered the release of Liam and his father, had harsh words for ICE and the Trump administration's approach to mass deportation. In his order, he wrote, quote, "The case has its genesis in the ill-conceived and incompetently implemented government pursuit of daily deportation quotas, apparently even if it requires traumatizing children." He added, "Observing human behavior confirms that for some among us, the perfidious lust for unbridled power and the imposition of cruelty in its quest know no bounds and are bereft of human decency, and the rule of law be damned." His order made clear that neither Liam nor his father should have been arrested in the first place, much less shipped from Minnesota to a detention center in West Texas. But they were still worth about $1,650 apiece to CoreCivic during the time that they were held there. That money, and money from tens of thousands of other people torn from their families and communities, will show up in the company's next quarterly earnings.
Thank you. This concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.
The Mississippi artist who became known as L.V. Hall was born as L.V. Bentley in 1942 in McAdams, an unincorporated community in the middle of the state, about 6 miles west of Kosciuszko. Hull later said that she was creative from a young age, making, quote, "little things out of mud like little dogs, dolls and things, little men." She added, "We didn't have no paint back then, way back in the country." She graduated from Central Mississippi College, a school for black students in Kosciuszko. She married a man named Frank Hull in 1961, and they had a son in 1964. The next year, L.V. and Frank got divorced. A few years later, her son died of a respiratory illness. Hull lived by herself the rest of her life, supporting herself by doing house cleaning and domestic work. And she continued making things that pleased her. In 1974, when she was 32, she purchased a house on Allen Street in Kosciuszko, which quickly became a sort of sanctuary and ever-evolving art space. She filled it and the surrounding yard with paintings, collages, sculptures, made from all manner of household goods, discarded items like tires and toys and egg cartons. Anything that came her way could be incorporated into her colorful aesthetic ecosystem. Her home/studio gained notice as a local landmark over the years, first from friends and neighbors, and eventually in the wider world. After she died in 2008, a group calling themselves Friends of L.V. Hull worked to settle her estate and preserve and protect as much of her work as possible. It was eventually transferred to the Kohler Foundation, and then in 2022 was given to the Arts Foundation of Kosciuszko. Now, that work and Hull's home are being made available to the public. The house is scheduled to open this spring as the L.V. Hull Legacy Center, displaying not only Hull's work, but also the space where she lived and created. And later this month, on March 20th, the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson will open an exhibition called L.V. Hull, Love is a Sensation. It is the first major museum show dedicated to her life and work. It will run through June 14th. A documentary about Hull with the same name, Love is a Sensation, will also premiere this spring at both the museum and the Legacy Center. Hull's work is the kind of art that critics and historians have tended to classify as folk art or outsider art, distinctive work by untrained creators that reveals a strong and personal vision. Hull had a perhaps more apt term for it. She called herself the unusual artist. You can find links with more information in the show notes. I highly recommend clicking through to see photos of Hull, her home, and her work. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.